Hey everyone, welcome back to Buried Truth Project. Today we're diving into one of the most audacious crime sprees in American history, the story of Carl Gagosian, known as the Friday Night Bank Robber. For 30 years, this man robbed over 50 banks, stealing more than $2 million, and evaded capture using military tactics, meticulous planning, and methods that left investigators completely baffled. This isn't your typical bank robbery story. This is about a criminal mastermind who turned robbery into a science. Before we begin, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our deep dives into history's most incredible true crime stories. All right, let's jump in. Let's start with who Carl Gagosian was, because understanding his background explains how he became one of the most successful bank robbers in American history. Carl Gagosian was born in 1947 in Pennsylvania. His childhood was marked by poverty and abuse. His father was an alcoholic who regularly beat him. Young Carl found escape in two things: books and the outdoors. He became obsessed with survival skills, reading everything he could about military tactics, guerrilla warfare, and how soldiers evaded capture in hostile territory. But here's what set Gagosian apart from other criminals. He was brilliant. He had an IQ well above average and was accepted to multiple universities. He studied engineering and statistics, developing skills that he would later use to plan the perfect robberies. In the late 1960s, during the Vietnam War era, Gagosian became fascinated with military strategy and tactics. He studied how special forces operated, how they planned missions, how they entered and exited hostile areas without being detected. He wasn't planning to join the military. He was planning to rob banks. Here's where the story gets really interesting. Gagosian didn't start robbing banks out of desperation. He wasn't a drug addict needing money for his next fix. He wasn't supporting a family in poverty. He robbed banks because he saw it as the ultimate challenge, a way to prove his intelligence and planning skills against law enforcement. His first robbery was in 1973. Gagosian was in his mid-20s, and he approached it like a military operation. He didn't just walk into a bank and demand money. He planned for months, studying the target, mapping escape routes, and preparing for every possible scenario. And here's his signature method that made him nearly impossible to catch. Gagosian only robbed banks on Friday nights, right before closing time. He chose this time deliberately. Friday nights meant the banks had more cash from the week's deposits. Right before closing meant fewer customers and staff. And hitting at the end of the week meant he had the entire weekend before the investigation really ramped up on Monday. But the method that really made Gagosian unique was how he approached and escaped from banks. He didn't drive up in a getaway car that could be traced. Instead, he would hike through woods and fields, sometimes for miles, to reach the back of the bank. He wore camouflage and carried his robbery gear in a backpack. He looked like a hunter or hiker, completely inconspicuous in rural and suburban areas. Gagosian would hide in the woods near the bank for hours, sometimes days, observing patterns. He'd note when employees arrived and left, when security guards made their rounds, when the bank was busiest, and when it was quiet. He treated it like a military reconnaissance mission. When the time was right, Friday evening, just before closing, Gagosian would approach the bank from the rear, usually through a wooded area or field that wasn't covered by surveillance cameras. He wore a mask and gloves. He carried a pistol, though he claims he never intended to use it and never fired it during a robbery. Here's his method inside the bank. Gagosian was calm, controlled, and efficient. He would vault over the counter, literally jumping over it like an athlete, and go directly to the drawers where the cash was kept. He never demanded money from tellers verbally in a way that would let them identify his voice. He used hand signals or brief, muffled commands. He grabbed the cash, usually $20,000 to $50,000 per robbery, and was in and out in under 2 minutes. Then came the escape that made him nearly impossible to catch. Instead of running to a getaway car, Gagosian would run back into the woods. He'd sprint through forests and fields, following pre-planned escape routes he'd mapped out during his reconnaissance. He'd run for miles, sometimes 5 or 6 miles, through terrain where police cars couldn't follow. He would have supplies cached in the woods, changes of clothes, food, water, sometimes even a bicycle for faster escape. He'd change out of his robbery gear, bury it or hide it to retrieve later, and emerge from the woods looking like an ordinary hiker or jogger. By the time police set up roadblocks and started searching, Gagosian was already miles away, looking nothing like the description witnesses provided. Here's what made this method so effective. Police were looking for someone in a car. They set up roadblocks on roads. They searched parking lots for suspicious vehicles. They never thought to search the woods for a man on foot or bicycle. Gagosian's military-style escape through wilderness terrain completely bypassed traditional law enforcement response. And it worked. Robbery after robbery, Gagosian escaped. He hit banks in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and other states. Each robbery was meticulously planned and flawlessly executed. He never left fingerprints. He never left DNA evidence because he wore gloves and a mask. He never spoke enough for voice recognition. He was a ghost. But here's what's remarkable. Gagosian wasn't robbing banks constantly. He would rob one or two banks, then disappear for months or even years. He'd use the stolen money to live modestly, invest in the stock market, and plan his next jobs. He wasn't living a flashy lifestyle that would attract attention. He lived in apartments, kept to himself, and appeared to be an ordinary, quiet man. Between robberies, Gagosian continued his education. He earned multiple degrees, studied law enforcement techniques, and read about how criminals got caught so he could avoid their mistakes. He was constantly improving his methods, staying ahead of police tactics. Investigators knew they had a serial bank robber, but they couldn't catch him. They called him the Friday night bank robber because of his timing. They had composite sketches from witnesses, but they were inconsistent because Gagosian wore disguises. They had no physical evidence linking the robberies. And most frustratingly, they had no idea how he was escaping. Some investigators theorized there must be a sophisticated criminal network helping him. Others thought he must be a former Special Forces operative using military training. The truth was stranger. He was a self-taught loner using tactics he'd learned from books. By the 1990s, Gagosian had been robbing banks for over 20 years. He'd stolen well over $1 million. And he'd never been caught. He'd never even been seriously suspected. It seemed like he'd found the perfect crime. But here's what Gagosian didn't fully account for. Technology was advancing. Banks were installing better security cameras. Surveillance systems were improving. And forensic techniques were becoming more sophisticated.
In the late 1990s, Gagosian began getting sloppy. Not dramatically so, but enough to leave traces. After decades of perfect robberies, he was becoming overconfident. He'd gotten away with it for so long that he started taking small risks he would never have taken earlier. In 2002, Gagosian was planning a robbery in Pennsylvania. He followed his usual method, scouting the location, mapping escape routes, preparing his gear. But this time, something went wrong. A police officer happened to be in the area during Gagosian's reconnaissance and noticed a man acting suspiciously near a bank, taking notes and photographs. The officer approached Gagosian, who gave a fake name and a plausible story about being a photographer interested in architecture. The officer let him go, but noted the encounter in his report. A few weeks later, that same bank was robbed using the Friday night bank robber's signature method. The officer remembered the encounter and provided a description. It wasn't enough to identify Gagosian, but it was the first real lead investigators had gotten in years. Then came the break that finally caught him. In August 2002, Gagosian was planning another robbery. During his reconnaissance, he left his car briefly to scout on foot. When he returned, police were searching his vehicle for an unrelated reason. They'd gotten a report about a suspicious vehicle in the area. Inside Gagosian's car, officers found maps with banks marked, notes about bank security, newspaper clippings about unsolved bank robberies, and a pistol. They arrested him on weapons charges, and that's when investigators started digging deeper. They searched Gagosian's apartment and storage units and found a treasure trove of evidence. He had kept meticulous records of his robberies, notebooks detailing each job, maps of escape routes, news articles about his crimes, and the actual gear he'd used in robberies. He'd kept it all like trophies or a military campaign log. Even more damning, they found some of the stolen money. Gagosian had buried cash in various locations and kept maps to these hiding spots. He'd hidden money in PVC pipes buried in woods, in storage units, in false walls in his apartment. He'd been planning for decades, preparing for retirement or emergency situations. The FBI connected Gagosian to over 50 bank robberies spanning 30 years. Using the evidence from his apartment and his own detailed records, they could prove at least 50 robberies and suspected he'd committed even more that he hadn't documented or where evidence had been destroyed. When confronted with the evidence, Gagosian initially denied everything. But as investigators showed him his own notebooks, his own maps, his own records, he realized there was no point in denying it. He confessed to everything. During interrogation, Gagosian was remarkably calm and even proud of his accomplishments. He explained his methods in detail, describing the planning, the execution, and the escapes. He talked about his philosophy, that robbing banks was a challenge, a game of intelligence between him and law enforcement. He saw himself as a professional, not a criminal. But here's what's interesting about Gagosian's psychology. He showed little remorse for his crimes. He argued that bank robberies were victimless crimes because the banks were insured. He claimed he never hurt anyone physically, and that the fear he caused was simply a necessary part of the operation. This attitude is common among bank robbers who see themselves as professionals. They rationalize their crimes by focusing on the money and ignoring the trauma they cause employees and customers. Multiple studies have shown that bank employees who experience robberies suffer from PTSD, anxiety, and fear that affects them for years. In 2004, Carl Gagosian pleaded guilty to multiple counts of bank robbery. He was sentenced to 17 years in federal prison. Prosecutors argued for a longer sentence given the number of crimes, but the judge noted that Gagosian had never physically harmed anyone and showed a willingness to cooperate with authorities. During his sentencing, Gagosian made a statement that shocked the courtroom. He apologized, but not for the robberies themselves. He apologized for getting caught. He said he was disappointed in himself for becoming complacent and making mistakes that led to his arrest. Even facing prison, he viewed his crimes through the lens of a tactical operation that had ultimately failed. Gagosian served his sentence and was released in 2017. He's now in his 70s, living under strict parole conditions. He's prohibited from going near banks, must report his location regularly, and is monitored closely by law enforcement. But here's the question that haunts investigators. Did Gagosian rob more banks than the 50 they could prove? He's hinted in interviews that there were other jobs he never documented, robberies where he destroyed all evidence. If that's true, the actual number could be 70, 80, or even 100 banks over his 30-year career. Let's talk about what makes the Gagosian case so fascinating from a criminology perspective. First, his success rate was unprecedented. Most bank robbers are caught quickly, usually within a few robberies. The average bank robber steals about $4,000 and gets caught within months. Gagosian stole over $2 million and evaded capture for 30 years. This makes him one of the most successful bank robbers in American history. Second, his methods were revolutionary. Before Gagosian, most bank robbers followed predictable patterns: drive to the bank, rob it, drive away. Gagosian's wilderness escape routes were so unconventional that law enforcement had no protocols for dealing with them. He literally ran through forests where police cars couldn't follow. Third, his discipline was extraordinary. He never bragged about his crimes. He never spent money ostentatiously. He never told friends or family. He lived a double life with perfect separation between his criminal activities and his normal life. This level of operational security is rare even among professional criminals. Fourth, his planning was obsessive. Some of his notebooks showed he'd spend 6 months planning a single robbery. He'd visit the target location dozens of times, at different times of day, in different weather conditions. He'd map out 3 or 4 escape routes in case the primary route was blocked. He thought of everything. Law enforcement has studied Gagosian's methods extensively. His case is taught in FBI training programs as an example of an exceptionally sophisticated criminal. But it's also taught as a reminder that even the most careful criminals eventually make mistakes. Here's what finally caught Gagosian. He got comfortable. After decades of success, he stopped being as careful. He left his car where it could be searched. He kept too much evidence instead of destroying it. He broke his own rules, and that's what ended his career. The lesson for law enforcement: persistent investigation, improved technology, and criminal overconfidence eventually catch even the smartest criminals. The lesson for criminals: crime doesn't pay in the long run. Gagosian spent 30 years robbing banks, stole over $2 million, and ended up in prison losing everything. If he'd used his intelligence and planning skills legally, he could have been extraordinarily successful without risking prison. So there you have it, the incredible true story of Carl Gagosian, the Friday night bank robber who robbed over 50 banks using military tactics and wilderness escapes. From meticulous planning to decades of success, from his eventual capture to the lessons his case teaches us about crime and justice. What's the most shocking part of Gagosian's story for you? Let me know in the comments. And here's a question. Do you think Gagosian was a criminal genius or just a smart man who wasted his potential? If you enjoyed this incredible true crime story, smash that like button and subscribe to Buried Truth Project for more untold stories. Thanks for watching, and remember, the truth is always deeper than the surface. I'll see you in the next one.